And this is Interface here on SABC2. Welcome to it. My name is Tembi Samachele. The AU Summit is in progress here in Johannesburg, and among other issues being discussed, the empowerment of women is a priority in line with the theme Year of Women Empowerment and Development towards Africa's Agenda 2063. But there's been another development at the summit. North Sudan's President Omar Al-Bashir has received an order from the Pretoria High Court preventing him from leaving the country until tomorrow, when the court has heard his case. The International Criminal Court wants the South African government to arrest Al-Bashir for crimes against humanity committed in the Darfur region of Sudan. So before we get into our discussion on women empowerment, let's first cross to the Sandton Convention Center, where my colleague Vuyo Mvoko is standing by to discuss this issue. Vuyo, good evening. Thank you very much for joining us.
Evening, Temzo.
Does this appearance by President Al-Bashir in court mean that he will automatically be handed over to the ICC?
Well, I think every step is going to be taken to ensure that, in fact, that doesn't happen. That's certainly what one is getting from the people who are involved or affected by this issue. But where both the AU and the South African government are coming from is a point of view that says when the AU, as the AU is here, it takes over this precinct where we are, and every head of state who is here actually enjoys immunity from such things. In the same way that when people go to the United Nations in New York, whether Fidel Castro in years gone by would have been listed as a terrorist in terms of the US's laws and so on, when he steps onto New York to attend a United Nations summit, he's immune. No one can touch him. And they're arguing that the same applies to South Africa, and that is why during the week, last week, Cabinet discussed this matter just to make sure that it covers all tracks. And from where they sit as the South African government, this issue doesn't even arise. Of course, no one anticipated that what happened today, the people who took this matter to court, would actually happen. They are convinced that even tomorrow in court, the court will rule in their favor, but they do stress the fact that the South African government will abide by whatever decision.
So who took this step then and took the matter to court?
It's an organization, it's a legal organization, NGO, if you like. It is not the government or anyone associated with it, obviously. And the people who did this are saying they are doing it in the interest of human rights across the world. And South Africa, being party to the ICC, it should actually honor its obligation. And its obligation in this instance is to hand over President Bashir to the ICC. But do remember also that South Africa is in a bit of a fix on this one, because it is in agreement with the AU, the broader AU membership, which we have said that the ICC is no longer what they signed up for. The ICC we are seeing today is hell-bent on actually prosecuting only African leaders. They are saying that countries and people who are not who didn't sign up for the ICC, who are not party, who are not bound by ICC conventions and everything that goes with that, are actually using that court and financing it to get back at their enemies. So they are very unhappy. In fact, the AU has started a move to set up an African court, which they believe will be much more effective because they keep on underlying the fact that they are not promoting impunity. They believe that those that are guilty of human rights violations across the continent and beyond should face the might of the law. However, they are saying the ICC isn't doing that. It is being populated by people who are in the pockets of those that are funding the ICC, and many of those people actually do not even have the experience that is required to preside or to sit through the matters that come before the ICC. And thirdly, they believe that it is the Western powers in particular that are hell-bent on putting something akin to a kangaroo court to basically prosecute those people that they do not like.
So, Vuyo, speaking of those Western powers, what kind of diplomatic fallout are we likely to see then as a result of this? Because there are those that are in favor of such a move, and there are those that are against it.
Well, I mean, if you take the South African example, by its own admission, the ANC is divided or has been divided on the issue of whether to really dump the ICC and actually put its lot behind the effort of the AU to try and set up an African court. Because there are those people within South Africa's own ruling party who believe that actually something can be done to actually get the ICC to mend its ways, but also the party of Mandela, the country of Mandela, should be seen to be respecting, and engaging with those it disagrees. So there is a problem there. But coming back to your question, if it was to happen that President Bashir gets prevented from leaving this country, there's going to be a huge fallout. You can rest assured it'll be the end of South Africa's stature within the community of African countries, because the AU is unequivocal about the position that it has taken. In fact, from where the AU sits, this matter does not even arise. So it'll be a huge embarrassment if South Africa was to be forced to hand over President Bashir to the IEC. So at this stage, no one seems convinced that they will even get there. But who knows? We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow in that court. But as things stand, no one, the South Africa in particular, hopes that nothing will happen that will embarrass them in front of the continent.
All right, let's leave it there. Thank you very much for talking to us, the SABC's contributing editor, Vuyo Mvoko. And we take a short break. We're back after this.
Say goodbye.
Welcome back. You're watching Interface and we're talking about the empowerment of women. And we are in conversation now with the Special Envoy on Gender at the African Development Bank, Umama Geraldine Fraser-Moleketi. But before we talk to her about the state of women on the continent, let's first take a quick look at this report produced by Kinosi Queen.
Women are a tremendously untapped resource in many developing countries. In most countries, at least 50%, if not more, of the population is female. Therefore, underemployment of women means an underdeveloped economy, lower GDP and lost potential. It is not any different here in South Africa. Out of 51.8 million South Africans, 51.4% are women. But it is men who are mostly in charge of business and the economy. Gender inequality is also reflected in employment figures. According to the 2011 Gender Statistics Report, the number of women without jobs is almost 3% higher than the national average. This is despite women's proven success as micro-entrepreneurs around the world. South Africa's gender wage gap is also among the worst in the world, according to the report. In 2013, the average taxable income for women was about 16,000 rand a month. Men earned about 21,000 rand a month on average. In the higher income brackets, only 4.6% of women earned more than 500,000 a year, in comparison to 11% of men. Problems of gender inequality are exacerbated by the lack of access to education, health care, economic participation, and social constraints. The 7th AIDS Conference reports that South African women between the ages of 15 and 24 years have the highest number of new infections. Gender activists and experts say because women outnumber men in terms of population figures, it is only fair and makes sense for them to have equal access to services and economic participation. The World Economic Forum's report on the gender gap says long-term economic growth is driven by people and their creativity. Therefore, discriminating against women negatively affects economic growth. The report also shows that companies that employ women at the top tend to perform better than those that don't. Research also shows that women leaders make different decisions which may be aimed at including other women and creating an environment which is nurturing and empowering. Kinosi Queen, Interface.
And let's talk to our guests now and welcome her. Thank you so much for your time, Mama.
Thank you.
Geraldine Fraser-Moleketi. Now, depending on who you ask, women have either made too little progress in terms of economic empowerment in particular, or we've made some significant strides. Which side of the debate are you on?
I think that I don't want to look at either one or the other side. I think what's very clear is when we talk about the inclusive growth agenda for the African continent, we've got to ensure that we use all the human capital on the continent, and that's men and women. Very clearly, we saw some data that points to the fact that it makes economic sense. It's important from a rights perspective that you ensure that women, girls, young people are involved in this broad equation. As the African Development Bank, we also came out with a report that's called Empowering African Women, an Agenda for Action. And it's an index that looks at 3 areas. The first one is looking at the economic empowerment for women, or women as producers. Secondly, it also looks at human development. I mean, what's the reality of women when it relates to education, reproductive health, and so on. And then thirdly, it looks at women as active citizens and leaders. And we looked across 52 countries on the continent to look at how they were doing. And I think it's very clear when you look at that report that you've got to invest in women and girls in order to turn around Africa's development and growth story. And it's also about ensuring the rights of women and girls.
But this is something we know, and it's been reiterated in this AU summit now. And the focus on women empowerment in this year also is testament to that. But there seems to be some kind of disconnect between what we say needs to happen and what is actually happening on the ground. What do we do to bridge that gap?
Well, let me say that we've clearly seen development, and let's take a 20-year snapshot. 1995, we went to Beijing, and you would recall the chair of the African Union was the leader of the South African delegation to Beijing. I was the deputy leader. And at that point in time, you did not have the same focus that you have today from government, the private sector, or civil society on the reality and need for equality of women. South Africa was a bit different, however, because we had, in 1995, just adopted our constitution. And our constitution is quite clear on the equality of all people, non-discrimination. So, I mean, we were in a particular space. But you'd never have dreamt 20 years ago that the African Union would have women's economic empowerment on its agenda as an item for discussion. Much as we have seen in the early 2000s, that African leaders have clearly adopted various conventions and so on that supported this particular agenda. So we have moved, but what we are saying is we've not moved fast enough. And the insert reflected on how diverse boards can contribute to better performance of companies. And we've also just come out with a report that says, where are the women, inclusive boardrooms in Africa of top listed companies. Now, when you look at this report, Africa is actually leading the emerging markets in terms of the number of women on boards of listed companies. And we are at 14.4% of large companies, companies who own sort of, what is it, about $1 billion plus the size of these companies. But the issue is that we are not satisfied with that. Because if that's the case, and if we are seeing good performing companies, surely it's a waste of human capital if we don't involve women more. In Burundi, for example, 90% of women are in either survivalist sector, setting up survivalist business, or in startup companies, but they don't really break through. So we've got to use that, because if again in Africa women are involved in the entrepreneur sector, let's use them better. Let's actually see how to do that.
So how do we use this focus that you're talking about then? The focus that the African Union has, the focus that even your bank has on women empowerment. How do we use that to actually make sure that it translates into more development and faster development and women empowerment on the ground?
Let's bring together the pockets of excellence that's there on the continent, and let's use the convening power of both the African organs on the continent. Let the bank use its convening power to bring together businesses, private sector, governments and otherwise, and see how we can take things forward. Now, let me give you an example. I mean, one way of catapulting women into the next millennium, if I can put it that way, is by using ICTs. And right now we know that women on the African continent is only using 20% of ICT and is less as compared to men. But the last point I want to make, 1,500 kilometers from Khartoum, there's a woman that's selling tea in a market. She has a smartphone, and one of the bank's specialists experts who are working in the area said while she was in this market, this woman was approached and given an opportunity to start a taxi business. So someone wanted to sell her a taxi, and she used her iPhone to both make a call and check whether the price at which this taxi was being sold was really competitive. that you would not have had 10 years ago.
Yes.
So let's use ICTs, let's use technologies to take us forward, but let's also use the ability to network and bring the private sector and public sector as well as civil society together. And let's see how we can crowd in the possibility of walking the talk. Because I think rhetoric is fine, but we want to ensure that women have greater access to finances, that there is value chain financing, and that we're able to support women from the seed right up to the market. So we need to have trade included.
That's precisely what I want us to pick up on right after the break. And remember, if you would like to take part in the discussion, you can do so via our social media pages, Facebook at Interface on SABC2, or on Twitter at Tembisa Magele, or at Interface on SABC. Do stay with us. Welcome back. We are in conversation with Ms. Geraldine Fraser-Moleketi, who's the Special Envoy on Gender at the African Development Bank, and we are talking about the empowerment of women on the continent. So before the break, we're talking about just what is happening on the ground and some of the improvements that we're seeing and how we are likely to build on that. Talk to us a little bit about the financing of women's businesses and what kind of political will we're seeing from different countries on the continent to make sure that women do succeed.
Yeah. You know, we've seen commitment from governments on financing and access to procurement. So you have countries like South Africa, Zambia, Kenya, and I'm just mentioning three of them that have very clearly said that with any public procurement, there should be a provision of a percentage going towards women. And this goes by the point system and so on. Within the bank, we are saying that with every bank project, we want to look at earmarking the funding. We want to ensure that there is gender marking, and we categorize projects where we say this project clearly we see as a gender project, or this project is more the kind of project that's open to it. And then some projects will say this is a bit more difficult and this should be gender neutral. So clear targeting on financing. Now, talking about political will, at the last annual meeting of the African Development Bank, which was in the last week of May, African finance ministers came together in a community of practice. And a decision was taken, and this came out in the communique, it was part of the resolution, that at every annual meeting, the bank's president will chair a meeting of finance ministers, and they will look at financing for gender results. Now, I think that's a major shift, because generally speaking, the focus is on women or gender ministers to deal with this. But the budget really lies with the finance ministers. And this is going to cause the break that you've said with what we've had from the past. But the second issue is, within the ADB, we've reviewed our small and medium enterprises policy, and we're very clear that there's got to be a large percentage that goes to women. In certain instances, and there's one fund that we say will be a woman-specific fund led by women fund managers. But in other instances, there are SMEs that are actually focusing on women. Look at Equity Bank, that's led by James Mwangi. If you look at his book, he's essentially funding women. And the returns on his book is very high. You know, when you look at the bottom line, because women repay their debts. And I think as a result, we should ensure with financing for women that there shouldn't be this inordinate amount of documentation that's different from what men need to provide when they access financing. Agriculture is the sector where you have the largest number of women, either employed or eking out an existence. And yet when you look at agricultural financing for both men and women, it's quite difficult.
Let's touch also a little bit on the gender parity issue. That's been a huge issue that's been dominating the discourse around the empowerment of women. How do we deal with that one?
I mean, what is it? The African Union took a resolution, I think it's as early as 2002, to say there should be equity for women at all levels of society. The African Union has achieved it in the sense that the African Union Commission has 50% women and men commissioners, so they've achieved it. We look at elected representatives. South Africa's done very well, Rwanda's done even better at 63%. But then it staggers, you know, if you look across the continent. But in the private sector, we need to do better.
But I'm looking more also at the pay parity issue.
Yes.
The difference in what is paid to men and women for doing the same job.
Let me talk about South Africa. And I was Minister for Public Service here for a number of years, you know. We have parity in pay. So in the public service, it's equal pay for work of equal value.
Okay.
But what we found is that when women enter a job, they don't negotiate the entry salary. So you'll find that men may come in and more deliberately negotiate to come in at a different notch. And this we found elsewhere as well. In the African Development Bank, we've just completed a study looking exactly at this issue, and we find this is prevalent. But we feel that in those sectors where there's not equal pay for work of equal value, that should be done away with, because that's clearly discriminatory. And right now we know in many sectors, women earn at least 30% less than men.
But shouldn't those companies be penalized in some way for doing that?
I think we should probably look at what incentives we should put in place for companies that do well. And maybe it's time to name companies who don't do well and actually ask them to explain.
All right, let's leave it there. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. Thank you so much for talking to us. Mam Geraldine Fraser-Moleketi is the Special Envoy on Gender at the African Development Bank. We'll leave it there for this evening. Do join us again next week at the same time. Goodbye.